Previously, we learned that consumption consists of two components. The first is the autonomous consumption, which is the amount of consumption that is not dependent on income. And then we have another amount of consumption that is dependent on disposable income. Consumption can be expressed as a linear function of disposable income. So this is the most basic form of consumption function. C stands for consumption function equal to A sub 0. Okay, so this 0 is a little bit big here, but it's supposed to be a subscript. So A sub 0 plus B times disposable income. Y sub t stands for disposable income. Okay? So this is the most basic form of consumption function. However, as we move on, as we go further, we will very soon have to put together aggregate expenditure that consists of not only consumption, but also investment, government spending, and net exports. Those three components of expenditure are not dependent on disposable income. So to generalize our analysis, let's transform this consumption function into a function of a more general measure of income. For example, national income. Okay? So in order to do that, we need to first decompose the disposable income. Okay? So one simple way to decompose disposable income is that we know that disposable income is the income after all the deductions and personal income tax. So we simplify things a little bit by assuming that all other deductions and taxes have been paid and have been made. So now we use the national income, a more general measure of income, minus the income tax, and then add transfer payment. Okay? Add transfer payment. So that will give us the disposable income. So income tax minus transfer payment, we can call that net taxes. So disposable income is national income minus the net taxes. And then we rearrange the term a little bit. Okay? So pull this term of net taxes to the left. So lump them together. Okay? So, and then we give it a new name, little a, instead of A sub 0. Okay? So this little a here is still autonomous consumption, but this time it has included the net taxes and the transfer payment. Okay? So now we have a more general consumption function, which is a function of national income instead of disposable income, okay, or just income in general. So let's do a little bit of an exercise. Let's suppose that we are given the autonomous consumption, which is $50, and we are given the marginal propensity to consume, which is a little b here, and then is 0.75. So let's do two things. Let's try to find the amount of consumption that is dependent on income, and let's find the total consumption then. Okay, so let's spend about 5 minutes. So let's take a pause, do a little bit of exercise. So I hope you have spent some time doing the calculation. For calculation, practice is very important. So let's take a look at it. Okay? So let's look at the first row. Okay? So this is the amount of consumption that is dependent on income. B times 0. So this is when the income is 0. So obviously it's 0. Consumption is equal to A plus B times Y. That's what we have just seen. Okay? So that would be 0 plus 50, or 50 plus 0. So that would give us a total consumption of $50. Let's try one more. Okay? When the income is 100, okay, the amount of income, the amount of consumption that is dependent on income is $75. That's 0.75, which is given to us, multiplied by the income. Okay, so that will give us 75. In order to find the total consumption, that's autonomous consumption, A plus B times Y. So that will give us a total consumption of 125. One more before we move on. So the income is $200. So the amount of consumption that is dependent on income is $150. That means it's 0.75 times 200. Okay, 0.75 times 200. So that will give us $150. So the total consumption is A times B, A plus B times Y. So A plus B times Y, 50 plus 150. So that will give us $200. All right. So I hope if you haven't finished the calculation, I hope you can take some time to complete the calculation for all of them. Okay, so now we're going to derive a consumption function graph. So before we do that, let's go back to an assumption that we make. When you recall the beginning of the semester, when we calculate GDP, in addition to expenditure approach, we also introduce ourselves to income approach. So using income approach, and assuming that all adjustments have been made, we learned that in the beginning of the semester that national income is equal to GDP. Okay? National income is equal to output. Okay? So with that assumption, from this point onwards, when we see Y or income, we can assume that it is equal to output. Okay? So here, C as a function of income. But because of the assumption that we have made, this Y here can also be equal to real output. Okay? So consumption as a function of income or real output. So this is how a typical consumption function looks like. It is upward sloping. And on the vertical axis, we have the consumption. On the horizontal axis, we have the income or the real output. Okay. So when you recall what you have learned in your math class, if you have a linear function like this, that little a is actually the y-intercept, okay, here, okay? And that little b is the slope. Okay? Slope, as you recall in your math class, slope is the rise over run. When you look at the rise, the vertical distance, that's simply the change in consumption. When you look at the horizontal distance, which is the change in income. Okay, so the slope is actually the change in consumption divided by the change in income. So that would give us the marginal propensity to consume. So in other words, this little b here represents marginal propensity to consume. So let's play with the graph a little bit. Okay, so we will first learn to draw a change in marginal propensity to consume. So let's assume that there has been an increase in marginal propensity to consume. So let's say previously, okay, so initially we have what? Initially, let's say the marginal propensity to consume was given to be 0.75. So now let's suppose that we have an increase in marginal propensity to consume. Let's say we have 0.8 now. So when the marginal propensity to consume, what that means is if I previously, when I have $1 extra of income, I would spend 75 cents of it. But now I would spend 80 cents of it. So I respond more to a change in income. Okay. So graphically, we have learned that that little b is simply the marginal propensity to consume. So if the marginal propensity to consume increases, what that means is the slope becomes larger. Graphically, you can see a steeper slope. Okay, the steeper slope, a larger slope. Okay, if you are not sure, you can do a little bit of experiment. You can pick any horizontal distance. Okay, any horizontal distance. You find that with a steeper curve, you will find a larger change in consumption. Okay, so that's a larger marginal propensity to consume. So the intercept stays the same, the autonomous consumption stays the same. We're not told of any change. So with an increase in marginal propensity to consume, we're gonna end up with a steeper consumption function curve. In contrast, if we have a decrease in marginal propensity to consume, we're going to end up with a flatter consumption function. That said, a change in marginal propensity to consume is actually not our focus here in this classroom. Our focus is more on a change in autonomous consumption, that little a. Okay? So this is how we illustrate an increase in autonomous consumption. Okay? So previously our autonomous consumption is $50. So suppose now it has increased. It has increased to $80. So you can see that the y-intercept moves up. Okay? So this is how we illustrate an increase in autonomous consumption. So the whole consumption function shifts upward. Okay? Upward. Okay? So we have this a little 0, which is the initial autonomous consumption, and now we have a new autonomous consumption, a sub 1. Okay? So in contrast, this is how we illustrate a decrease in autonomous consumption. Okay, so suppose initially the autonomous consumption is $50, as you recall. So now we are told that the autonomous consumption is $30. So this whole curve here shifts downward. Okay, so this is how we illustrate a decrease in autonomous consumption. So what caused these shifts? What caused the autonomous consumption to change? We are going to go back to what we have learned very shortly before. Okay? So we talk about some of the determinants of autonomous consumption, some of the factors that will influence consumption. So as a result, these are the factors, these are the determinants that can shift the consumption function. So we talked about consumer confidence. In fact, we actually talk about expectations of future income. Okay? Consumer confidence is a broader category than expectation of future income, because with consumer confidence, people may feel good about their future job prospect. They may feel good about their raise in income, and they may feel good about the promotion and so on and so forth. They may feel good about making money in the stock market or other kind of financial investment. So it is a broader category of expectations than expectations of future income. So as consumer confidence increases, very intuitively, consumption should increase. We also talked about wealth previously. So intuitively, as wealth increases, consumption increases. How easy it is to get financing, how easy it is to get credits is also a very important factor, important determinant of consumption. If people find it easy to get loans, they're more likely to spend. And then we have income tax policy. If we have a lower income tax, we are likely to see that people consume more. And then in transfer payment, if we have an increase in transfer payment, we're likely to see an increase in consumption function. And then price level. Lastly, as the price level comes down, we are likely to see an increase in purchasing power and consequently consumption function. So all these can lead to a shift of consumption function. So what we're going to do next is to illustrate how consumption function corresponds to aggregate demand. So let's pick an example. Let's suppose wealth increases. Okay? Wealth increases. So we know that so wealth increases. Okay. So suppose we do an example. So wealth increases. So what is likely to happen is that consumption increases. So because consumption is a component of aggregate demand, we are going to see an increase in aggregate demand. Okay? And this is illustrated graphically here. On the left-hand side, we have the consumption function. So an increase in consumption is illustrated by an upward shift of the consumption function curve. Accordingly, we are going to see an increase in aggregate demand. So it is illustrated by a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve.